So I think I've had 3 or 4 lawyers that I have interviewed this week, and I love it. I mean, that's my life, and that's what I've done for almost 50 years. So Molly's a lawyer. We could talk about what she does. She's a professor at New York University. She teaches constitutional law. I mean, we could switch this to a political topic if we wanted, but she's written wonderful books that introduced me to something I didn't know about. When Books Went to War, and then the one we're going to talk about, The War of Words. But I'm going to start this different than I've ever started one of these sessions before. Normally, I would just jump right in and ask her questions, but these books, and I may even cry, these books really mean something to me. When my father was 18 years old, I found a letter of his when he turned 18, that he was writing back to his mom. And it's a letter that he says somewhere on the boat in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and he was on his way to Okinawa with his Marine unit. He was 18. Throughout his life, until he passed away at age 87, I asked him many times to tell me, what was it like? What was it like being on Okinawa, being a Marine on Okinawa? And he never once answered until about a month or 2 before his death at 87. And I asked him again, figuring I may not have many more chances. And not expecting an answer, but he paused. He started to cry. And this is all he said, one sentence in about 2 or 3 seconds. He said, "Every day on Okinawa was like the opening scenes of Saving Private Ryan." And that's all he said. And in reality, that's all he needed to say. So I thought I knew. So because of his experience, I thought I'd read everything about World War II. I thought I was a pretty good expert on World War II until I met Molly and until I read her books. She's already talked about the one book, which is called When Books Went to War, and today we're going to talk about the War of Words. And I love how she describes it here, how America's GI journalists battled censorship and propaganda, quote, to help win World War II. So how did you find out about this?
So after When Books Went to War was published, I received an email from a World War II veteran, and it said, "When Newspapers Went to War" as the title. And I thought, oh no, did I miss something big? And he said, no one's ever said anything about these troop newspapers that we read, but we lived on these. We read books too, but these newspapers were everything to us. And so I thought maybe you meant Yank, the Army Weekly, or Stars and Stripes, because we've all heard of those even today. And he said, no, not those. The little ones, the ones that we mimeographed. And I thought, I have no idea what you're talking about. And we ended up having a friendship for many, many years, and he ended up taking photocopies because he kept every one that he had. So he sent photocopies to show me what he meant. And then as I researched it, I found out that there was over 4,600 different troop newspapers that were published by different units and divisions across the world. And I thought, this is remarkable, because at a time, if you're in the military, you're not supposed to say what you think. You take orders and you follow them. You don't talk back. Some of these get really sassy, and it's the soldiers talking back and complaining and saying what they really were thinking. And it's just a remarkable part of World War II history that I think should not be lost.
So why the title, War of Words?
So the reason why newspapers became so important was that during the 1930s, so we didn't enter the war, the United States didn't enter the war till December 1941, but in the 1930s, there were already German groups and operatives in the United States that were publishing things like the newsletter that you see on the display to try to convince Americans that it would be futile to join World War II. We would definitely be beaten. We would just have all of our youth be killed. The German army was superior. And so this is called Facts in Review, which I think is an ingenious title because it's a bunch of propaganda, not fact-based. One of the headlines says truth versus fiction, as if they're clarifying that. They're actually just making it worse.
And who was it published by?
It's published by the German Library of Information.
And we're not talking about something published in Germany. This is
No.
something published in the United States.
In the United States, actually in Manhattan. And they had waterfront offices, so they could actually see all of the ships coming into the United States and all the ships coming out of the United States. And so they were just right here. And this was mailed to Americans for free. So it would just show up, and you could get your copies of Facts in Review and trust the German Library of Information to tell you what was happening in the world and what
And
you
was
should
this
think.
the only one? The
No.
only organization?
No, there is over, I think, 18 organizations with all different names. So Crusaders for Freedom and things like that. So they sound democratic or pro-American, but they were all published by Germany. And they were not meant to give you facts. They were meant to give you a perspective that you were supposed to start believing.
And this wasn't unique just to the United States. They were doing something similar in Germany, too. Tell us about that.
So in Germany, as soon as Hitler rose to power, there was an editorial control law passed. And to become a journalist or remain a journalist in Germany, you had to file with the German government and receive credentials from the German government. So you had to be Aryan, so did your spouse, and you had to promise that you would publish what directives the German government was providing to you. And so what ended up happening is every day there'd be these press briefings, and all of the journalists would be told certain messages that needed to be included in their articles. And so it didn't matter what German newspaper that you read, because they'd all consistently have these themes that were required to be included in their articles. And so what happened is the public in Germany was being peppered with ideas like, oh, Poland is bad. Poland is doing atrocities to German citizens. And it was all make-believe. None of this was actually happening. But it was planting the seeds to justify attacking Poland years later. And if that's the only news that you're getting, and it doesn't matter what newspaper you're reading, it starts to feel like it's probably true.
And it was the law, right?
It was the law.
Editorial control law of October 1933.
Exactly.
So it wasn't, though, that there was just censorship in Germany. There was also some censorship in the United States. I mean, some, in a sense, you can understand why. But talk to us a little bit about Executive Order 8955.
So FDR did sign an executive order that created the U.S. Office of Censorship. And the idea was that certain military information was too sensitive to allow to potentially fall into the hands of the enemy. And we know that there were German operatives in the United States because they're publishing things like Facts in Review openly. And so FDR created this Office of Censorship, and the Office of Censorship created a booklet that listed all of the prohibited topics that you weren't allowed to talk about. So if there was a new factory that was going to be building war supplies, you could not mention that there's a new factory in town building war supplies. You couldn't mention if troops came through town. You couldn't mention just about anything related to the military. And so it was difficult, I think, for civilian correspondents to know what can you actually say, as there is a war going on that involves the military. So we need to be able to talk about this.
And so tell us what happened at the New York Times with Arthur Schlesinger.
So with the New York Times, they were trying to publish news stories about what was happening without falling afoul of these guidelines from the Office of Censorship. And so there was this British ship that was torpedoed, and it needed to get repaired. So it came into New York Harbor for repairs, but it actually went right past the German Library of Information because they're right there to see it. They moor in the harbor. The British soldiers come off the ship and have a great time in New York wearing their uniforms. And the New York Times wanted to print a story just saying, this ship's here to get repaired, and it seemed obvious. And the Navy said, you can't print that story. And so the publisher of the New York Times responded to the Secretary of the Navy saying, this is ridiculous. The Germans can see the ship. The Germans who are here can see the ship. You've got a bunch of British troops running around Manhattan with their uniforms on. Like, we're stating the obvious. And the Secretary of the Navy said, well, if you continue to comply with the voluntary censorship, we won't have to make it mandatory. And so then the publisher of the New York Times said, okay, then we're going to intentionally violate the code of censorship because this is just asinine, or you can relax the regulations. And so he wouldn't stand down. And so the Navy was pressured actually by FDR to maybe release a little bit more information and make it okay for the newspapers to say obvious things.
So we did that because it kind of gives a background as to the propaganda coming from Germany, the restrictions here, and the need kind of to explain what was going on in the war so the public understood what the purpose was, why we were there, and what we were doing, and what was happening. But kind of the same thing is happening with the troops and the position they're in. So how did newspapers originate in somebody's idea to allow the GIs to print them themselves? So tell us about that process.
So the idea of troops printing their own newspapers during World War II, when you compare that to the civilian journalists who couldn't print basic information about what was happening out in the open, it seems astounding that such a thing could even exist. Like if your life is the military and civilian correspondents can't talk about a lot of military affairs, what on earth could you possibly publish as a soldier? But as it turns out, the Chief of Staff of the Army, George Marshall, he believed that this was an army of civilian soldiers and you had to give them some kind of civilian pleasures, really. And at the time, most soldiers read the newspaper, mostly for the comics, to be honest, but most of them had familiarity with the newspaper. And they were really wondering, like, what is happening in the world and why are we wearing uniforms and what's the relevance of this? And the Army tried to feed them all sorts of videos and messages about, why we fight. Frank Capra made a whole film series about it. But the troops didn't really like being spoon-fed reasons to fight. They wanted to sort of understand it for themselves. And so George Marshall thought if we allow them to write their own newspapers, chronicle what they actually see and hear, what they're doing, that will give them more respect and satisfaction in the jobs that they are doing because they're in the newspaper. But also they can start making sense of what's happening. And it was revolutionary. The only reason that it happened was that he went to FDR to see if FDR would be okay with this idea, because of course FDR signed this executive order creating this Office of Censorship. But FDR had, during the 1930s, gone on presidential cruises on Navy vessels. And those Navy vessels had shipboard newspapers. And the shipboard newspapers had gossip and all sorts of shenanigans about what was happening on board. But it also had like the menu for dinner, and it had if there was going to be a movie and things like that. So everyone lived by these, including FDR. So
He
FDR,
they even had him on the mailing list.
He would write his name on the top of every single one that he received just to make sure no one would take it. And he brought them all home with him, and they're all actually in his library in Hyde Park still. So when Marshall said, hey, do you think it would be okay if I start this Army newspaper program, FDR loved the idea. And yeah, he wanted to be on the mailing list for whatever the troops were printing because he knew this would be a way for me to understand what the soldiers were going through.
But weren't the soldiers even being bombarded with German propaganda?
They were. So the Germans were experts at propaganda. They had an extremely high budget for it, and they had great intelligence. And so what is remarkable is they would know exactly where a troop location was. They would know the number, and they would print a booklet or a pamphlet really quickly that would say, to the 45th Division, we know where you are, and we're going to come and find you. And we see that there's a river to your left, and they would have all of these details that would be absolutely precise, absolutely correct. And then they would drop the propaganda leaflets right on the 45th Division. And that was the most unsettling thing. I mean, could you imagine if you got a letter in your mailbox that said, so-and-so, I know where you are, and I know you live here. But that's what these propaganda leaflets did. And it would say, you face forces that are so large that if you don't surrender, it's certain death, and your loved ones would prefer a POW who's alive rather than a dead soldier.
And how did that affect their morale, and how did the newspapers somewhat change that?
So the only way to counter that information was to have a counter perspective or a counter offensive, and that ended up being the troop newspapers, because the US Army had Army intelligence too. So if you could give that information to whoever's in charge of the troop newspaper, you could correct the record and say, no, it's actually not a very strong unit of troops. There's 10 Germans over there. And then everybody would understand we're not going to surrender, and we're going to fight, and we'll actually advance. So we had to dismantle that propaganda by providing actual factual information.
So it all sounds like a great idea,
Right.
but how do you do it? How did they accomplish this? Publish them, write them, distribute them?
So it's not like they had printing equipment at the ready. So what the US Army did is they created a kit, a publishing kit, and an officer or a chaplain could order one. And a crate of supplies would arrive, so you'd get some Underwood typewriters, you'd get a mimeograph machine, you'd get paper and ink, and every 2 weeks you'd get a fresh box of paper and ink. So you could produce these newspapers by writing them out and then churning them out on a mimeograph machine. And so you could print them anywhere you went. And then if you were on the move, you'd pack it back into the crate, throw it on a Jeep, and it would go to the next location.
And it wasn't just for soldiers on the ground, it was for Navy also, correct?
Right, the Navy also had a program. The Army was much larger than the Navy, so oftentimes if the Army created a program, they were in collaboration with one another all the time. So the Navy would do a lot of the same programs. It was easier for the Navy though, because they could have just a room on the ship that was just dedicated to printing newspapers. But the Navy vessels had regular publications, and many of them.
So tell us some of the names of the different papers.
So I think you could tell whether the officer supervision had a sense of humor or if they were really strict based on the titles of the newspapers. So there was one unit that was called the Tough Sheet. There was one that was called the Hospital Gazette. There was, for a parachute division, their newspaper was called the Screamer. And then for a center that received brand new troops and processed them, it was called the Homewrecker.
So I love the one for a Navy ship, the Gangplank Gazette.
Yep, the Gangplank Gazette.
There was one for Jewish servicemen.
Yep, L'Chaim.
And one called Hell on Wheels. So,
Yeah.
and tell them about FUBAR.
So there was FUBAR, which I'm going to use the family-friendly version of that, which is fouled up beyond all recognition. But they, just the titles themselves would let you know this is going to tell you the real story of what it's like to be at war and that it's not so pleasant.
So I want to switch from what we traditionally think about the war and who was in the war to women. Because I think, if I have it right, there were over 300,000 women who volunteered. So kind of tell us about their experience, how they were treated, and what they did with their newspapers.
I was very surprised when I was researching this part of the book, actually, because my impression was always that women, they were these trailblazing individuals who won the respect of the nation because they were doing such amazing work by volunteering to be in the military during World War II. And it actually wasn't that way at all. The women who volunteered, there were these horrible rumors that spread that the only reason why the Army accepted so many women was because their patriotic duty was basically to be prostitutes and serve as dates for the male troops. And that was completely false. But a lot of women ended up being, if you saw a woman in uniform, they were disrespected because that was what most people assumed. There were even letters that were going home from men that said, to a wife, like, you joined the Women's Army Corps? Like, how could you do this to me? Like, all of my buddies are making fun of me now, and we're gonna have to get divorced. And there were actual divorces that resulted just because a woman volunteered to be in the Women's Army Corps. And so what the women ended up doing is they printed their own newsletters and their own newspapers to set the record straight. And so the headlines would talk about the things that they were doing to help win the war and the very real work that they were doing. And women were in combat zones, many died, and they sacrificed a lot in order to be part of World War II. And again, they weren't drafted, they volunteered. So it was really such a disservice for them. But there were some really popular cartoonists during World War II, like Milt Caniff. And he would illustrate special cartoons for the women's papers. And then that would go on the front cover of the women's paper, which when would you ever have a cartoon on the front page of a newspaper? But that got the men's attention because they saw this cartoon that was familiar, and then they'd see some of the contributions that women were performing. And the Army was always doing these research studies to figure out what troops were thinking. And there was actually a gradual improvement in how the men viewed the women who were serving in the Women's Army Corps.
So can I ask, and maybe we don't even want to do a raise a hand, but did anyone else know about this? Did anyone else know about newspapers? That's the experience I had, and that's why all of this was so revealing, and then especially about the women and how it countered the prejudices that they were being impacted with. So what other things did they publish in their newspapers?
So I kind of think that newspapers is almost a misnomer because they were so personal that they read more like journals. They had the most heart-wrenching, sometimes poems, sometimes tributes to fallen buddies. They had really amusing gripes, and sometimes they put these gripes into poems. And they would also just try to make sense of what was happening around them. Some of them had really sensational, the 45th Division News is exactly what I was thinking of. The 45th Division News had this cartoonist who you probably heard of, Bill Malden. He won a Pulitzer for the cartoons he produced during World War II. But he was so tired of the bad conditions that the 45th Division endured. And so he would draw a cartoon, have a really punchy tagline, where it's like, make sure you rotate your socks. And it's guys that are under, a bombardment and they're getting trench foot because there's no time to change your socks. So he always stuck up for the average soldier because he was an average soldier. And George Patton hated him for it. George Patton ended up having a showdown with him where Patton demanded that Bill Malden come to Patton's headquarters so that they could have a conversation. And Patton said, what are you doing? You're demoralizing everyone with these cartoons. I've never seen soldiers do or say or feel any of the things that you talk about. And I don't think you should be printing things like this. I think this is actively bad for morale. And Malden, being Malden, disagreed to George Patton. And so Patton said, if you ever set foot in my territory again, I'm going to throw you in jail. Only Patton swore a lot, so he said it much more colorfully than I just did.
Kind of like FUBAR.
Yeah, kind of like FUBAR.
And did they ever resolve that difference?
No, but Bill Malden did stay out of the territory of George Patton because he would, in fact, be thrown in jail.
So you talked about the poetry, and
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that in your book, there's a lot of poetry. Do you have any idea why there were so many poems in these newspapers?
So the poems did go through censors, and troops were not allowed to say precisely where they were, and they weren't really supposed to have any context clues that would suggest where I am. Like, I'm somewhere in Europe, but I see the Eiffel Tower. Okay, you're in Paris. So, you can't include any kind of details that would give that kind of information. But I kind of think that they would include things in poems that they thought the censor might disapprove of, but maybe the censor didn't bother to read the poetry column because it's poetry.
So I'd like you to read a couple. The first is on this page, and then the second one is on the next page.
Okay. So these are from when troops were in the training facilities in the U.S., I think. The first one says, Dear John begins her letter, but the way she used to start was, Dearest darling Johnny boy, my very own sweetheart. I would have written sooner, but I'm busy, that is why. I know she must be busy, and I wonder who's the guy. The weather's very pleasant, and I hope you're feeling well. What a difference from the things she always used to tell. Her letter ends sincerely. Boy, now isn't she a pal? The income tax collector writes as friendly as my gal. Another one was written from someone who was very homesick. Sometimes these poems captured such universal feelings that the troops would just cut out the poem and put it in their letter because the poem did the speaking for them. But this one says, here I sit on my GI bed with my GI hat upon my head, my GI pants, my GI shoes, all is free, nothing to lose. GI razor, GI comb, gee, I wish that I were home. They've issued me everything I need, paper to write on, books to read, my belt, my socks, my GI tie, all are free, nothing to buy. They issue me food that makes me grow, gee, I wish I were on furlough. I eat my food from a GI plate and buy my needs at a GI rate. It's GI this and GI that, GI haircut and GI hat. Everything is GI issue. Oh, my darling, gee, I miss you.
So, including poems, they also had letters to the editor. Tell us about those.
So, I'm learning more and more that people are less in touch with the traditional function of newspapers. But you used to write letters to the editor to comment on your impression of a story or your impression of a local event, or just to speak your mind. And it would kind of become a place where you could read your neighbors' attitudes about things. And in GI newspapers, that was no different. And so you would write if you were upset with some aspect of your life. Can we make this a little better? Can we, improve on the raincoat? Because every time I wear mine, I'm wetter wearing it than when I had it off. So they would just complain about all sorts of things. But there were some very serious letters of complaint that were mailed to Yank and the Stars and Stripes especially. And troops would read those letters to the editor, and then they would comment on them. And then people would comment on the comments. And so you'd end up having this worldwide dialogue about different issues. And really, at the end of the day, for democracy, having a worldwide dialogue about important issues at a time when there's no other way to communicate with one another in such a way, it's really impressive that they had that.
So who was publishing Yanks and the other one you mentioned?
The Stars
and Stripes.
So the U.S. Army had an overarching version of both, but then they had independent offices, like satellite offices, all across the world. And that helped them print them faster and get them to troops faster. But they were generally only printed and published by average soldiers. I think on the Stars and the Stripes, you weren't allowed to have an officer on the staff. They all had to be low-ranking troops. Mm-hmm. And George Marshall said, that's the way that I want it. And he's chief of staff, so that's the way it was. And in Yank, FDR actually wrote an article for the first one, and he said, your enemies would never understand a publication like this, where we let you talk about how you feel and what you see, and to give you this degree of freedom of expression. So he said, all of you who write this, who read this, you are delegates of freedom. So it really meant a lot. He loved the optics of it, of giving troops the freedom of expression. Of course, that was one of the 4 freedoms. But he really sincerely felt that way.
Was FDR kind of key to these, in a sense?
He was, and it was just that, throwback to that experience when he rode the Navy ships during his presidential cruises in the 30s, where he understood these things, for whatever reason, they bring everybody together, makes you a more solid fighting unit. It's better for morale, and it makes you feel good about what you're doing.
So tell us about, and I want you to read something, but tell us about Corporal Rupert Trimminghams and his letter, and then read the part here where I've bracketed it.
So the military during World War II had a strict policy of racial segregation. The higher-ups in the Navy and the Army both believed this is not a time for, and this was their word, a social experiment. It would be, we have one war to fight. We're not going to fight more than one at a time. So it's going to be a strict policy of racial segregation. The problem was, the problems with that are endless, but they ended up introducing racial segregation to places that didn't even have it. And there were a lot of troops that were that entered the military, and if they were from the North, they weren't really familiar with the ways of the South. And so most training facilities, by the way, were in the South. And so there was a story, there's a soldier who was in Arizona. He was a black soldier, and he was given an Army assignment in Louisiana. And so he had to take a train from Arizona to Louisiana. And he was so surprised by the way he was treated in Louisiana that he decided to write a letter to the editor of Yank the Army Weekly. And he actually said in one part that I don't quote here, "I bet you won't even publish this." And this is what he said. So he talks about how he had a one-night layover in Louisiana, and he discovered we could not purchase a cup of coffee at any of the lunchrooms because, as you know, old man Jim Crow rules. And he said the only place where we could be served was at the lunchroom at the railroad station. But, of course, we had to go into the kitchen. But that's not all. 11:30 a.m., about 24 German prisoners of war with 2 American guards came to the station. They entered the lunchroom, sat at the tables, had their meals served, talked, smoked, in fact, had quite a swell time. I stood on the outside looking in, and I could not help but ask myself these questions. Are these men sworn enemies of this country? Are they not taught to hate and destroy all democratic governments? Are we not American soldiers sworn to fight for and die, if need be, for this, our country? Then why are they treated better than we are? Why are we pushed around like cattle? If we are fighting for the same thing, if we are going to die for our country, then why does the government allow such things to go on? And then he went on to ask, I told you about the Frank Capra films, Why We Fight. And so he said, I'd like to know, why are black soldiers fighting?
So what impact did it have?
So it turns out, you can have all the segregated facilities that you want when people are training, but in the chaos of war, you can't keep people separated. You're all part of one army. And so troops overseas had fought in all sorts of mixed race divisions for a while now. And they wrote to Yank and they said, these are some of the best soldiers that we can imagine going to war with. We have seen them in action. Why are they being treated like enemies? And then one man wrote on behalf of an entire white division, and he said, if this is the way you're treating Americans back home, we, white soldiers, are wondering, what are we fighting for? And it turned out, it disproved this idea that you couldn't have racial integration during World War II. The troops that were exposed to any kind of racial integration during fighting saw that there's no difference between white and black soldiers. We're all Americans. And so they wrote, this went on for months, like letter after letter after letter went into Yank the Army Weekly about different experiences in all different theaters of war and how it was just really upsetting to troops that they were fighting, even against this idea of an Aryan race. And yet back home, it seems like that kind of attitude is being perpetuated. So they really were wondering, what are we fighting for? What are these values that are so precious if we're treating people just the way that Germany is treating people and we're fighting against Germany?
So in your research, what did you find with regards to this last part of your sentence, that it helped win World War II?
I think that George Marshall was precisely right, that if you give troops the opportunity to write newspapers and say whatever it is that they need to say. They were also really disgruntled because sometimes they would receive domestic newspapers and magazines, and the way that the civilians were constrained by censorship, they weren't really telling the home front really what it felt like or really what it was like. And so troops felt this duty to say how bad the war was in their own newspapers and then mail them home so that the families back home would get a glimpse of what it was really like. And so They helped win World War II, I think, because they tried to spread as much factual and truthful information about the war. You know, there was also this understanding for civilian correspondents. You didn't want to say, everybody's dying in this battle, because that's demoralizing for the home front. So there was always kind of a cheerier tone to everything. And the troops didn't really like that. There's nothing cheery about war or battle. And so they wanted to make that clear.
So one of the most memorable parts of your book is talking about an editorial that was in Stars and Stripes. It was an unsigned editorial that said, "So you want to go home." So tell us about that, and then if you could read some of the parts of what that letter was.
So there was an unidentified editorial that was sent into Stars and Stripes. It was written by an officer, though. And, you know, there weren't supposed to be any officer submissions. But if you have all low-ranking people, and then you have an officer that says, you need to print this, and that's an order, what are you going to do? You don't really have any power to say no. And so they had to print this thing. But because it was called an editorial, everyone who read it thought that the staff of the Stars and Stripes had written it, or the editor of the Stars and Stripes had written it. But it was called, "So You Want to Go Home, Eh?" And everyone who read it got so upset. It said, that the editor was hearing there's this chorus of, "I want to go home" talk that made it seem like this one panty-waist army with our great big American supermen were ready to pack up and leave this legalized murder to the nurses, whacks, and clubmobile girls. Or, those who were stuffing troops with donuts. And the editorial said, it's man's work. Whether it's lifting stuff out of the holds of ships or highballing it to the front, it takes a hairy chest and a strong back. And so the editorial told the men to lift their heads from their tear-stained pillows and take a look at the wreckage and the misery of war around them, and thank God their own homes don't look like that. So immediately, the troops wrote their letters to the editor, and they said, well, maybe the editor would like to trade positions, because I'm sure you have, a strong back and a hairy chest, writing that in some office far from the front. And if you were near the front, you would know we don't even have pillows. We dream about having pillows, but you have no idea what you're talking about. And they said, as much as this is miserable, as much as we hate being here, we would not stop until the fighting is over. We're not going to get up and leave this to someone else. But there was such blowback over it that General Eisenhower actually reached out to the Stars and Stripes and said, don't ever publish something like that again. Just stay true to the average soldier and write what they are actually saying, because this is causing a demoralization of the Army. The stuff that you normally print where everybody's complaining about how gross the spam is and things like that, they like that, so print that. And Eisenhower also said, if anybody else is trying to do this, you can say by order of General Eisenhower, you can't print it.
So the newspapers really gave the person in the foxholes a voice.
It did. It really did.
So tell us about, and I thought that I had it on here, and I'll try to find it when you do this, but the mimeographed one-page edition of the 42nd Rainbow Infantry Division World News, dated May 1st, 1995, and then I'm going to have you give us kind of a background on that, and then I'm going to give you a little portion to read.
So because all of these troops were self-sufficient with their mimeograph machines and their crates of materials, you ended up having some pretty seasoned journalists going everywhere that the soldiers went. You also tended to have photographers sometimes, or you'd at least have a sketch artist. And so they chronicled everything everywhere, and they were pretty skilled. Some actually had newspaper backgrounds to begin with. But when the 42nd Division, they were supposed to be going straight towards Berlin, I think, and someone stopped them and they said, aren't you going to go to Dachau? And they said, well, what's Dachau? And they said, well, it's a camp where people are being killed. And so the general of the 42nd Division sent a few guys to go check it out, and it was just a couple miles off the route. and then they felt duty-bound to do something about it. So they abandoned the orders to go on, and they went to Dachau, and they liberated it. But because you had journalists right there doing the liberating, one of the generals said, I want you tonight to write a newspaper, and I want you to write everything that you saw. I want you to capture exactly what it was like. And we're going to print enough copies that they can be mailed home after you've all read it. No one actually wanted to read it, by the way, because it was so disturbing to experience it that most of them said decades later that Dachau was something that they wished they could have forgotten because it was just such a hauntingly awful experience. But they did mail them home. And it's one of the most important contemporaneous accounts of the war, I think, that you could imagine. But it's got a handwritten masthead. It's a mimeographed piece of paper. It doesn't look like a newspaper at all. It doesn't look very important at all. But they did not want civilian correspondents to come in 2 or 3 weeks later when everything had improved somewhat and then say what it looked like. And so they published this account, and it is just hard to read, honestly. All right, I'm going to try to keep it together. So they talk about how they enter Dachau, and they said that they were expecting these hardened soldiers, because they had served in combat all over, they expected to see horrible sights. But no human imagination, fed with the most fantastic of the tales that have leaked out from the earliest and most notorious of all Nazi concentration camps, could have been prepared for what they did see there. Riflemen, accustomed to witnessing death, had no stomach for rooms stacked, almost ceiling high, with tangled human bodies adjoining the cremation furnaces, looking like some maniac's woodpile. And when an officer pressed through mobs of the forgotten men of all nations inside the electric barbed wire enclosure and entered a room where lay the dying survivors of the horror train, he wept unashamedly as limp ghosts under filthy blankets tried to salute him with broomstick arms, falling back in deathly stupor from which most would never rouse. It goes on to describe the conditions in that manner. And then they talk about how it was incredible that such things could happen today, but there was the visible proof. It was unbelievable that human beings were capable of perpetuating such unspeakable atrocities, but there were the men who did it, the SS. It's just, I quote it liberally because they wanted that to be mailed home because they wanted the home front to understand. And I felt like I've never read anything like that, even though I've read who knows how many hundreds of books about World War II. And so I thought to honor them, that should be reproduced in the book. So it's largely in there, but it is the most touching and horrifying piece of writing that you could imagine.
So we only have a minute. We're going to end it with one more poem. There's so much more in the book, but end with this.
All right, this poem's called Fubar, which we now all know what that means. But this is from the South Pacific. And the man says, have you ever sat through a picture show while the rain seeped through your trousers, Joe? Have you ever labored in mildewed clothes or stepped on a lizard with your naked toes? Have you ever stood till you thought you'd choke in line for beer or a glass of Coke, only to hear that familiar shout, sorry guys, we just ran out? To be just a little more specific, have you ever been in the South Pacific?
The book's wonderful. Thank you, Molly.
Thank you.